This might be a metaphor for existence itself. A wild animal, a fish, struggles instinctively against an almost formless antagonist. The fish is a largemouth bass, and the confrontation recurs in waters completely across America, maybe 1 million times a year. The bass is best known as a sport fish, and it may be the most popular sport fish in the world. Sometimes it's simply called bigmouth. To man, to anglers, it's an intelligent species not easy to trick with an artificial lure. A battler which can completely shatter the strongest tackle, even a handsome creature in a slightly overstuffed and underslung way. But it's also part of a vast natural pattern of plants and animals, and exists only within that element, which may explain why it intrigues people in the first place. It's axiomatic that an angling day begins early, and this is determined less by man than by bass. Like many wild animals, the bass is most active toward dawn or dusk, most likely to prowl around and find food. The bass lives mostly in warm, fertile waters, in weedy green lakes, deep reservoirs, in ponds that seem little more than soggy spots on the land, in swamps and slow-winding rivers. The point of angling is to penetrate the habitat, to observe it intimately enough to theorize where the fish are, and just what lure and technique might trick them. Environmental phenomena, weather and water temperature, and whether the birds sing, all seem to indicate something about fish behavior. But the indications are never quite consistent. So in an age of technological imperatives, angling is one activity which still depends profoundly on guesswork and intuition. The angler becomes more than mere observer. He mentally works his way into the natural world, into the plasmic translucence of the stream, which is simply to say he tries to think like a fish. The bass, even one of those uninitiated bass found in what few wilderness waters we have left, has a strenuously evolved instinct for survival. Run a boat by and he's not about to just jump aboard. It takes practice to time and aim and smoothly shoot out an accurate cast, and then to retrieve the lure with an action that suggests something alive and swimming. And it takes some tactics to finally make contact with the fish. Hooks and lures, line and knots are assembled, according to each angler's own plan, to his assessment of hydrodynamics and anatomy. This equipment, then, is made to creep, swim, crawl, and just generally travel through the bass's territory. The idea is to isolate a pattern, to catch fish in a certain spot, and then find other spots that look the same. If one 15-foot drop-off produces fish, so should another, or so the story goes. In truth, the approach is not so much scientific as merely inventive, because the behavior of bass, their inclination to move and feed at any particular time, depends on such a raveled complex of environmental conditions and inborn characteristics, of stimuli and responses, that no one can ever completely map it out. From an angling perspective, bass remain bizarrely unpredictable. One tactic is to try different baits and different ways of working them. Sooner or later, something will work, some combination of lure and technique and location. When or if the bass comes aboard, the sum is not conquest, but confirmation of the angler's basic intuitions about his surroundings. Some natural swerve has been traced, some pattern partly revealed, which, after all, was the aim, and so the bass is simply released. Unharmed, the bass heads for a home whose essence no angler can quite have imagined. That home or habitat is not the clear, open water which offers no shelter. Instead, the fish finds its way into the weeds, the dark and secluded and almost impenetrable tangles. It hangs out around logs and other obstructions, through which the light filters with a subdued and almost cathedral quality. Its existence seems almost solitary. In the dimness, it looks all alone, though its habitat inevitably overlaps with that of other species. The lives of gars and bluegills and painted turtles are all interdependent with the bass, all intertwined in a natural skein. The survival of each species is essential to the whole, and so the bass makes ritual movements into the sunlit warm shallows to spawn. It happens each spring. On shifts seemingly as obscure as this depend the stability and continuity of an entire ecosystem, and the bass suddenly seems more than a sport fish. As spring begins and water temperatures rise, the bass take on distinctive spawning colors. The male is tinted green, the female blue. Her eyes become dusky and opaque, while his remain bright. And usually the male is the smaller of the two, sometimes by several pounds. courtship gets underway gradually. Several days before spawning, small groups of bass form around logs overhanging open water, where they begin to rub their undersides repeatedly against the rough surfaces. Most of these fish appear to be females, and no one has been able to explain exactly why the performance takes place. Whatever the reason, it all goes on for 5 or 6 days. The male bass locates a likely spot for the nest. He sweeps it time and again with his tail, and all the silt and muck and nondescript debris are carried away on the current. The nest is situated near shore, usually 2 to 10 feet deep, where sunlight penetrates to warm the water, a sort of natural incubator. In time, the nest begins to show up as a bright spot on the hard bottom. When the nest is completed, the male drifts off in the direction of passing females. Around one of them, he starts a series of slow looping maneuvers. He swims along, pivots, starts over again. Sometimes groups of fish form, both sexes, all of them swirling around in apparent confusion. But sooner or later, the bass begin to pair off. All the activity attracts a female to the nest. The male sweeps the nest again, or both bass do it, but only briefly. Spawning is about to start, and with it, the entire involute life cycle of the species. Finally, the female bass is ready. The male, despite his smaller size, maneuvers her over the center of the nest, and then all the motions are made in a sort of gyroscopic suspension. The female is no longer colored blue, but has become a shiny silver. The dark mottlings stand out more sharply. As she tilts slowly through the nest, she deposits the first of the eggs. Several hundred eggs are turned out at a single time. The process is repeated over and over until the nest may contain 4,000 to 6,000, and sometimes several times that many, up to 30,000 or more. The exact number of eggs depends mostly on the age of the female. The younger, more vigorous fish usually produce far more than the larger, older ones. The survival rate of the egg seems almost impossibly low. At best, only 1 in 1,000 may ever become an adult bass. The rest are killed by quirks of weather, by sudden cold or clouded water, or by predators. From time to time, at least every couple of minutes, the male fertilizes the egg mass. He settles onto his tail, then sweeps through the nest, discharging the sperm. The eggs swirl in the backwash and tumble evenly over the bottom. Spawning keeps the bass intensely occupied, and it's a good time, maybe the best time, for a close look at them. It's also the time when a whole sequence of predators starts to appear. By far the most abundant are bluegill sunfish, which mass implacably around the eggs and soon become a serious threat to their survival. But the bass guard the eggs aggressively. They spin on the axis of the nest and stand the bluegills off. The female leaves the nest early, but not immediately after spawning. Sometimes she stays for an entire day or two and is the more active defender, while the male is busy fanning sediment away from the eggs. Sometimes a bluegill tries to break in from behind and almost always is stunned. But neither bass eats it. In fact, bass eat nothing at all during the entire progression of courtship and spawning and care of the young. Intruders come in all shapes and sizes. A pair of golden shiners, a large species of minnow, swerves in and out of the nest. Sometimes the trouble is another bass, a second female ready to spawn. In many waters, females outnumber the males, so some are unable to deposit their eggs. The resident female keeps the leftover fish out of the nest, circling and shouldering it away, and eventually it swims off. Not all the intruders are fish, and some have trouble taking a hint. After a day or two of guarding the nest, the female finally abandons it, just centrifugally spins off and slowly makes her way into deeper and darker water. With the male left on his own, the problem of protecting the eggs is compounded. The defenses are half down, and a question of endurance arises. Inevitably, the bass becomes tired and less aggressive. In time, he must contract his perimeter, allowing the bluegills to come closer and closer. If he flares away to scatter some of them, still others swim instantly into the nest. One by one, the eggs start to disappear. But the bluegill is not quite an enemy. Bass and bluegill evolved together, and their lives interact, even coordinate. The bass overbreeds, and the bluegill regulates. If all the eggs hatched, bass might be stacked from shore to shore. Still, it amounts to a struggle for survival of the species. Bluegills may destroy nearly all of the nests. They crowd around, and the bass just gives up and goes away. On his own, he may have held out for only a few hours. Somehow, a few nests survive. The male bass stays active and aggressive enough to keep predators away, and the weather and water temperature remain warm enough for incubation. Usually, the eggs hatch in 3 to 7 days after spawning. Until the eggs hatch, the male bass fans the nest with his pectoral fins. The turbulence keeps silt from settling onto the eggs and smothering them. Finally, the larvae emerge from the eggs. A small tail simply pops away from the orb, softly wiggling and trembling. The larvae stay on the surface of the nest for perhaps 3 or 4 days and sustain themselves on their yolk sacs. They begin to ascend and swim in synchronization, still sharply watched by the male bass. They feed on plankton, microscopic organisms floating free in the water. In this early swimming stage, the young bass are called fry, and they hang together in a soft, billowing school. In the right light, they seem to compose a single pellucid membrane adrift on the current. They blend with the dense vegetation and shifting light of the shallows, and they're almost invisible to predators, to minnows and panfishes. Even the eyes of the male bass began to bulge crazily, as if he were straining to keep the fry in sight. As the fry continue to feed, they soon reach the fingerling stage. Then anywhere from 15 to 25 days after hatching, the young fish are abandoned, left to their own interstice. The male is moved away by himself. Unguarded, the scattered pods of fingerlings start to collect in larger schools. They move like metallic darts through the sunken undergrowth, and for weeks seem almost to disappear. But during this same period, the adult bass do appear, working along the weedy edge. Most of these fish were spawners and haven't eaten for an entire month or more. And the evolved mechanism which kept them from feeding, from swallowing their own young, no longer functions. Now they cruise the shallows and forage actively on the fingerlings. Bass on the lookout for food are likely to make mistakes, to strike an artificial lure. For fishing, it's one of the fastest times of the year. The lure need not look just like a fingerling. As long as it moves, a bass might hit it. The fingerlings have grown rapidly to a length of 2 or 3 inches, and they seem to feed nearly non-stop. In some waters, they stuff themselves with tiny freshwater shrimp. The mottled coloration of the fingerling melds with the sandy bottom. Sometimes the fish lies still for long periods, but when it works on the shrimp, its attack is sudden, almost raptorial. fingerlings feed heavily on wigglers, the tiny aquatic larvae of mosquitoes. These insects spiral erratically to the surface, where they float briefly before transforming into adults. And somewhere on the way up, the small bass stop thousands of them short. In time, the small bass start feeding on other fish. The small bass grow to 5 or 6 inches in only a few months. They still travel in loose schools, but they begin to drift off into deeper and somewhat more open water, where they find different foods. And so autumn arrives. And with the cooler water, the adult bass grow hungry again. They work up and down the deep channels in wolf packs on the prowl. They find whatever forage they can, which still includes that same season's small bass. In fact, in the fall, a large bass will strike at almost anything alive and more or less mouth-sized. smaller bass still school somewhere near shelter, often flaring away to feed. And they face an almost unending series of predators, even where the water is apparently safest. Along twisting shorelines and remote backwaters, wading birds still manage to find them. A great blue heron stalks the interface of water and land, and in a sense entirely aboriginal, a bass is recycled. And the anhinga, or water turkey, which is not a wading bird but a diver. As it sits on a log or overhanging limb, wet wings outstretched and drying in the sun, it looks surprisingly clumsy, not at all fit for a predatory existence. But its gargoyle appearance is actually the mark of extreme adaptation. When it drops into the water, into the habitat of the bass, it moves itself smoothly along. The odds are almost overwhelmingly against any young bass, but the species is somehow able to survive. A few fish even live to old age, which could be as long as 10 years. Eventually, they die of disease or their time simply runs out. The reproductive process itself, the stress of spawning and overseeing the young, the almost interminable time without eating, eliminates many of the older and weaker adult bass. One mark of a dying fish is a pale mottling on its body, a culture of bacteria that forms first on the fins or head and then spreads over the entire fish. Still, the active spawning is an advance towards some species' destiny. Each spring, always, more bass are produced. The fish persists in the face of all of its predators. It is uniquely adjusted to them. The one obstacle it cannot surely overcome is man, not the angler, but the arbiter of the earth itself, man apart from nature. In a matter of months or days, he disturbs natural balances that took ages to evolve. The bass and other wild animals simply cannot adapt fast enough. Wetlands are drained, streams dredged into straight ditches, chemicals introduced that never existed before. So the bass has disappeared from many waters where it once was abundant. In a sense, man has made himself the consummate predator, the one from which there may be no escape. a subverted habitat, the survival of bass depends entirely on man, how he limits his expansion on Earth, and how he manages the fishery. So far, the bass has held its own. More and more, it lives in man-made lakes, in reservoirs built for flood control or hydroelectric power. And if these environments are not quite natural, then the bass is like man himself, living in surroundings increasingly artificial. If the environmental plight, the heedless alteration of nature, reflects our alienation from the Earth, then angling might be an act of transcendence. Through the bass, perhaps we perceive something about ourselves. For a few brilliant moments, we see that both species are part of the single system on which all life depends.